Hey everyone, it's Josh over with the Manchise, and coming back to you with another DFS breakdown for Saturday night's UFC Fight Island 2, Davis and Figueiredo versus Joseph Benavidez, Joe B. Super excited for this fight, especially coming off of a successful Wednesday night card. Hopefully you guys tuned in and checked out my video because crushed it in my main tournament, put up well over 500 points. I had Lerone Murphy in there and Munir Laziz. Both of those guys cashed as big dogs. And I came in 16th place in a tournament that had close to 3,000 entries. So trying to reel in some more money for you guys this Saturday night as well. So let's get right down to it with the first fight, which is Sergey Spivak versus Carlos Felipe in the heavyweight division. All right, there's not much to talk about in this one. I'm just kidding. We always have something to talk about. It's just weird because Carlos Felipe, where did this guy come from? I think he did Shudo Box in Brazil. Not much of a track record. His pro record's 8-0. And like I said, he'll be facing off against the Moldovan Sergey Spivak, who has a professional record of 10-2. Not going to be able to get a ton of stats in this one just because Carlos Felipe is making his UFC debut here. And I tried to do some research on him, and there wasn't a ton of video available out there for his professional fights. I was able to find some really low quality video of some of his Shudo Box matches, and from what I can tell, he's a heavyweight that really likes the pressure and push forward, kind of like a Marcin Tybura, which is funny because Sergey Spivak's last fight in the UFC was against Marcin Tybura, and he lost that fight. It was just decision, not a ton of action in that one, but so Carlos Felipe 8-0, but if you look at his most recent fights, it's tough to get a ton of information outside of the fact that his last 3 fights, 2 of them he did finish via KO or TKO, and those were against really no-name opponents, guys that have had 2 fights, 5 fights. Sandro Bezerra was his last professional MMA fight, which was 3 years ago. That guy had an 8-2 record. Carlos Felipe was able to knock him out for what it's worth. For Sergey Spivak, as I mentioned, he lost a fight to Marcin Tybura about 4 months ago, and that was just by decision. Before that, he did beat Tai Tuivasa, which... that was an upset, man. That was a crazy fight. He subbed him with an arm triangle choke. This guy, I will say, Sergey Spivak does have some pretty good BJJ. He's got some nice ground game. Before the Tai Tuivasa fight, he did get knocked out by Walt Harris. That was a little bit over a year ago. And then before that, I do want to mention this. He did fight in the WWFC against Tony Lopez. And I mean, if you follow MMA at all, you should know who Tony Lopez is. Been around for a very long time, and he was able to neck crank him. So Sergey Spivak, if he can get the fight to the ground, he does have some legitimate sub skills. Just looking at the size differential here, Sergey Spivak is the taller fighter by 2 inches, though the reach doesn't seem to be a ton of an advantage there. And these guys are both young fighters. They're both just 25 years old. So Vegas odds, Sergey Spivak -135. Carlos Felipe is +105. So it's basically a pick'em. Spivak is a slight favorite. I think when this fight first opened, Carlos Felipe opened as the favorite, and then some money was put on Spivak, and it kind of flip-flopped, but it's still in that pick'em range. I guess I like Spivak in this fight. It's hard for me to really make a choice because, as I mentioned, I couldn't watch a ton of Carlos Felipe. Now, if Carlos Felipe fights the way that I was able to watch him fight in the little footage that I saw, that pressure might present a problem for Sergey Spivak. So especially if you look at what happened to Spivak in his last fight against Tybura. He didn't really handle the pressure too well, and he was never able to really get in dominant positions on the ground and pull off legitimate submission attempts. And like I said, that there wasn't a ton of output in that fight at all. So Felipe's chance here is to stay away from the ground when fighting Spivak, to pressure forward, be in Spivak's face, and try to pull out a victory here. So I will say one thing about this fight from a DFS perspective. I just quickly peeked at all of the fights on this card coming up on Saturday night, and Vegas really thinks a lot of these fights are going to end up as decisions. And I probably agree with it, because you have a lot of really close, like, even matchups here. One of the fights that actually has better odds to finish and not go the distance would be this Sergey Spivak versus Carlos Felipe fight. So from a DFS perspective, it's not a bad fight to have some exposure to. Now, as I mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised if this fight went either way. If it went in Spivak's decision and he subbed Felipe, or if Felipe just knocked out Sergey Spivak, I wouldn't be surprised. So this is one where you probably want a little bit of exposure to both, but there's a little bit of a gap when you're looking at those DraftKings salaries. I'm pulling it up right now, and Spivak on DraftKings is right around the mid 8,000s, yeah, 8,400, and Carlos Felipe is 7,800. So I don't think I'll have a ton of exposure to either of these guys. They certainly won't be in my main lineup, but it's not a bad idea with a card like this to have exposure to one of those guys, because I think we're going to see a shortage of stoppages, unlike what we just saw Wednesday night. Wednesday night, as I had mentioned in the last video, it's usually those cards that have a bunch of UFC newcomers and no names, or guys that don't have a ton of hype behind them, that end up being like the most exciting cards. And that's what we saw on Wednesday night. Outside of like the main event and co-main event, there were a ton of finishes. So if you're chasing a finish, Carlos Felipe is not a bad guy to put in your lineup. I just won't have a ton of exposure. So we're going to move on to the next fight here, which is Davi Ramos versus Arman Tsarukyan. And that, of course, is taking place in the lightweight division, which is 155 pounds. We have Davi Ramos with a professional record of 10-3, fighting Arman Tsarukyan, who has a record of 14-2. Vegas has Davi Ramos as a slight underdog, plus 160, and Arman Tsarukyan is minus 200. Just taking a peek at the size here, Tsarukyan has a 2-inch height advantage, but their reach is the same. So Tsarukyan's a little bit taller of a fighter, 5'8". To Ramos is 5'6", but their reach is exactly 72.5 inches. I'm excited for this fight. That first fight could end up being a total slop fest. That wouldn't surprise me. But this second fight, Ramos versus Tsarukyan, I mean, both these guys are super talented. And both of these guys have now had some fights in the UFC, which is great because I'll be able to pull up some stats here, which is exactly what I want to touch on up front. So we'll just go over some striking stats here. Davi Ramos, 2.74 significant strikes landed per minute, 39% striking accuracy, 2.8 strikes absorbed. And for Arman Tsarukyan, 2 right on the head, significant strikes landed per minute, 40% striking accuracy, 1.23 strikes absorbed. And then from a grappling standpoint, Davi Ramos, 2.42 takedowns per 15 minutes, 50% takedown accuracy, an impressive 100% takedown defense. Not surprising considering he is one of the best grapplers in MMA. And then for Arman Tsarukyan, 1.5 takedowns per 3 rounds, 13% takedown accuracy, and 66% takedown defense. So striking numbers are pretty close. there's definitely a grappling advantage for Davi Ramos, who also pulls off close to 1 sub every 15 minutes. Looking at just kind of their more recent UFC fights, they do have a common opponent in Islam Makhachev, who is also known as like the mini Khabib. They both lost via decision to Makhachev. Davi Ramos has a win over Austin Hubbard. He won that by decision, unanimous decision. He was able to sub John Gunther. And I just laugh about that because John Gunther was the guy that was on The Ultimate Fighter that I think he herded llamas or something like that. Weird dude. But yeah, he was able to sub him, rear naked choke. He was also able to sub Nick Hein. Again, another rear naked choke. And he subbed Chris Grutzemacher, rear naked choke. So yeah, if this fight gets to the mat, Davi Ramos really against anyone in the UFC is going to have an advantage. I mean, this is a BJJ world champion. For Arman Tsarukyan, outside of losing his first fight, his UFC debut to Islam Makhachev, he did fight Oliver Aubin-Mercier. It's almost been a year, so it's been a while for Tsarukyan, and he won that fight by decision. It was a unanimous decision. I will say, with that common opponent in Makhachev, Tsarukyan was more impressive against Makhachev than Davi Ramos. In fact, Tsarukyan took that fight, I think, on short notice, was just a no-name at that point, and was able to really like hold his own with Makhachev. Now, Makhachev was able to take him down, but Tsarukyan wasn't easy to keep down. He was just great at scrambling, getting back to the feet. But it was just a difficult fight for him to take on short notice. And I guess that's why Vegas sees this the way that they're seeing it when you look at it at the Vegas odds, with Tsarukyan being a favorite at -200. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. And the reason for that is because though Tsarukyan has looked impressive so far in the UFC, he hasn't really shown me a ton of finishing potential. Now, he's fought 2 pretty game opponents in Olivier Aubin-Mercier and Makhachev, but you don't see a significant amount of striking output from him at just 2 strikes, significant strikes landed per minute. And he's not the most solid fighter. I mean, he is young. He's only 23 years old, so I'm sure he'll start to fill out. But at that 155-pound weight division, he's a little bit lankier. He does have some finishes on his record, some head kicks. So he is able to finish people, especially striking. But that wasn't against UFC opponents. So we haven't really seen a ton of power from him in the UFC yet. On the flip side, I had already mentioned Davi Ramos. If he gets a fight to the ground, it really doesn't matter who his opponent is. He has a huge advantage in the BJJ department. So I actually really like him here as a slight underdog, +160, because the way I view this fight is, if Tsarukyan's going to win, he's probably going to win by decision, and he's just going to outpoint Davi Ramos. Whereas if this fight does end in a finish, I'm going to give the nod to Davi Ramos. He probably tapped out Tsarukyan, or he landed him with one of those overhand rights. So Davi Ramos isn't a slouch when it comes to striking. He doesn't really put together beautiful combinations, though. He kind of he walks forward heavy, will throw an overhand right. He's looking to clip you, get the fight to the ground, so that he can then submit you. Clip you to submit you. And it could happen to Tsarukyan here. I mean, like I said, Tsarukyan looked good in the Makhachev fight, but he was still taken down. And if Ramos is able to take down Tsarukyan, then he could submit him. And that's why I really like Ramos for DFS as well. You know, when you're looking at fighters that are relatively big underdogs, such as Davi Ramos, in DFS, you're looking at the low 7,000 price point. And when I'm looking at fighters at that low 7,000 price point, I'm looking for one of 2 things. I'm looking for a fighter that I just have confidence is going to win the fight, like I did this past card with Lerone Murphy, or someone who has legitimate finishing potential. And I think Davi Ramos has proven that he has legitimate finishing potential in the UFC. So I really like Davi Ramos at 7,500. In that price point, you're looking at guys like Malcolm Gordon, Oscar Askarov, Ibragimov, Joe B, Brett Johns. I mean, there are some good fighters on this card in the low 7,000s, but a lot of those guys either really have tough matchups or they just don't have a ton of finishing potential. So I think this is a fight that not only Davi Ramos could really win, but I think he could get a finish here. So at 7,500, I'll definitely have some exposure. On the flip side, Sarukian, 8,700. I just don't love that. The guy averages 37.5 fantasy points per fight. Now I know that number's low because he fought Makhachev and was just constantly defending takedowns. But even in his win against Albin Mercier, he only put up 64 fantasy points. He had 47 significant strikes and 2 takedowns, just not a ton of output. So won't have any exposure to him. So we're going to move on to the next fight, which is in the flyweight division. Malcolm Gordon, the Canadian, is fighting Amir Albazi from Sweden. And both of these guys are making their UFC debuts and well-awaited UFC debuts. Malcolm Gordon was a champion over at TKO, and he's coming off of a nice little 4-fight win streak. And Amir Albazi, he's fought in Bellator, he's fought in Brave, he's got a record of 12-1, and he's been really good in other good organizations. So I am excited for this fight. Malcolm Gordon has a 12-3 record, so a 12-3 fighter versus a 12-1 fighter. Both these guys have pretty good records, and they're fighting in decent organizations. I don't know too much about TKO, but Bellator and Brave is really solid. The way that Vegas looks at this is they have Amir Albazi as a little bit of a favorite here at -170. Malcolm Gordon is +145. When it comes to size, they're pretty evenly matched as well. Malcolm Gordon's 5'7", Amir Albazi's 5'6". Just looking at Albazi's most recent fights, he did lose to Jose Torres, Shorty Torres, who fought in the UFC. And he just lost by decision in that. That was over a year ago. And then 8 months ago, he was able to submit Ryan Curtis at Brave. Curtis had a 5-1 record at the time, and he was able to submit him via key lock, which that's pretty impressive. He had a nice run in Bellator, didn't take any losses there, fought decent competition. For Malcolm Gordon, as I mentioned, he's on a 4-fight win streak, and all finishes there. Submission, rear naked choke against Yoni Sherbatov, which that's super impressive. Sherbatov is, UFC caliber fighter. He also armbarred James Mancini, 5-3 record. I don't know how much stock I would put in that. He subbed Jordan Graham via Kimura. Jordan Graham 2-0 again, not a ton of pro fights. And he was able to knock out Michael Jordan. No, not Michael Jordan, the shooting guard for the Chicago Bulls, who's one of the greatest basketball players of all time. But apparently there's a Michael Jordan MMA fighter as well. He knocked him out. Again, I don't know how much stock I'd put in that either. Guy had a professional record of 3-1. So I've been able to watch both of these guys, and I've seen Amir Albazi in Bellator. So I've got pretty good footage on him. I spent most of my time researching Malcolm Gordon just because I don't watch a ton of TKO. But there's some pretty solid footage out there on YouTube that you can get. And I've noticed 2 things about Malcolm Gordon. The first thing is he's got legitimate submission skills. If he gets this to the ground, he has the ability to sub you. Really nice rear naked chokes, can advance, take the back. So I always like to see that. But the other thing that I noticed about Malcolm Gordon is he kind of strikes like Tyron Woodley. Like, he's not very aggressive. He'll stay on like the back foot, kind of shell up, willing to take some shots. And I don't know if it's just because he's a slow starter or he's feeling out his opponent, but he he scares me kind of, because when you're that defensive, it just takes one clean shot to make it through your guard and hit you like behind the ear, and you could be put to sleep. In fact, he was KO'd. His last loss, he was KO'd 3 years ago against Dimitri Wardenberg, who's not like an impressive striker really at all. The guy had an 11-7 professional record. I don't know a ton about him, but we're not talking about a guy who was undefeated and just cracked Malcolm Gordon. So I think Amir Albazi has a solid advantage here if this fight stays standing. Not to say that Malcolm Gordon couldn't put Albazi out, because he certainly could, but because he does have some power, but it's just, I don't feel, put it this way, when I watch fighters that are that defensive and they're up, their backs against the cage and they're taking strikes, that only really ever works if you're fighting a fighter that's going to gas out. You're willing to take a few, work on his gas tank, and then you're going to come in and fire. And I don't think Amir Albazi is going to gas out in this fight. So I actually lean Albazi in this fight, -170. Those are decent odds too. I think it's pretty safe that you could put some money on Albazi. And I like him to win this fight. I think it's going to go one of two ways here. I think this is either going to go, it's going to be a decision for Albazi, or I think Albazi could sub Malcolm Gordon. As good as offensively Malcolm Gordon is in his jiu-jitsu, if he's, or just anyone for that matter, gets rocked in a fight and this goes to the ground, you're susceptible to being subbed. I could see Amir Albazi taking Malcolm Gordon's back and submitting him via rear naked choke. I mean, Albazi has a bunch of finishes on his resume. Rear naked choke, Kimura, rear naked choke, Kimura. So he's pretty solid when it comes to his jiu-jitsu skills. So in DFS, DraftKings, looking at those salaries, Malcolm Gordon, as I had mentioned, he's in the mid 7,000s at 7,600, and Amir Albazi's in the mid 8,000s, 8,600. I don't think I'm going to have too much exposure to this fight, because I do, as I mentioned, I think it's probably more than likely going to go the distance. Malcolm Gordon's not a horrible dart throw at that 7,600 salary. I don't think I'd pay up for Albazi. I think there's probably better options in the mid 8s. So, though I think he's going to win, I don't know if he's going to have a ton of output. Malcolm Gordon, mid 7s. I mean, like I said, it's a dart throw. I mean, could he get Albazi on the ground and sub him? Absolutely. And if he does, then there you go. He just paid off that 7,600 salary. I wouldn't expect it. I'm not gonna have too much exposure to Gordon, but you could do worse with the low 7,000s than Malcolm Gordon, or even mid 7,000s than Malcolm Gordon. All right, moving on to the next fight here, which is another good one. This one's in the bantamweight division. It's Brett Johns versus Montel Jackson, and both these fighters have really nice records. Brett Johns is 16-2, and Montel Jackson is 9-1. Montel Jackson is a pretty decent sized favorite here at -240. Brett Johns +90, but those odds have shifted a little bit. Some money has been put on Brett Johns fighting out of Wales, of course. Montel Jackson just has a size advantage in this one. He's 5'10", which is really big for that bantamweight division. 75.5-inch reach. So he's 3 inches taller than the 5'7" Brett Johns, and he's going to have a 5.5-inch reach advantage. So I just want to take a look at some of the last couple fights from Montel Jackson. I mean, both these guys are UFC veterans at this point. Montel Jackson, of course, was found on the Contender Series, and then his first fight, really tough draw against Ricky Simone. Lost that fight by decision. The fact that he was able to go The distance with Ricky Simone was pretty impressive, and that was almost 2 years ago at this point. But his last 3 fights, subbed Brian Kelleher, Darce choke. He beat Andre Sukumtoth, unanimous decision, and then he beat Felipe Colares by unanimous decision. For Brett Johns, he's been in the UFC for quite a while now. He's only won 3 of his last 5 fights, but he's had some tough draws there. We'll get to those in a moment. But dating back 3 years ago, he beat Albert Morales by decision. He beat Joe Soto, subbed him with a calf slicer. That was pretty too. That was a really nice sub. Then he lost to Aljamain Sterling, but that went to decision. So pretty impressive that Brett Johns didn't get subbed there by Aljamain, who's always a threat on the ground. Pedro Munoz beat him by decision as well. Again, Pedro throws heavy bombs, also is pretty solid at BJJ. And then Brett Johns' most recent fight was against Tony Gravely about 5 months ago, and he subbed him via rear naked choke. So when I look at this fight, it's hard for me to give the nod to Brett Johns, which is difficult to say that because Brett Johns has a little bit of an experience advantage. He's got that 16-2 record. He's fought tougher competition. Like, he's been in there with Aljamain. He's been in there with Pedro Munoz. So, those are things that I really like to look at from an underdog. Like, what's your competition like? How have you fared against those opponents? And Brett Johns has fared pretty well. The problem here with Brett Johns is he just really isn't better than Montel Jackson at anything. I mean, maybe jiu-jitsu. Like I said, we haven't seen a ton of jiu-jitsu from Montel Jackson. He's only been in the UFC for a little bit, like less than 2 years. But he does have jiu-jitsu skills. I mean, he Darce choked Brian Kelleher. That's not easy to do. So I look at, from a striking perspective, from a wrestling and grappling perspective, Montel Jackson just has a huge advantage here. And if I'm Montel Jackson, I'm keeping this on the feet. I'm taking that 5.5-inch reach advantage, and I'm going to control the distance in this fight, and I don't ever even let it get to a grappling standpoint. And I think if Montel Jackson's smart and his coaches know what they're doing, they're going to basically give him that same advice. Like, strike with Brett Johns here. Don't let this become a dirty grappling match. But even if it becomes a dirty grappling match, well, what's Montel Jackson's background? It's wrestling. He's going to be very difficult to take down. So, in fact, I want to pull up the stats here. Significant strikes landed per minute for Brett Johns, 3.3, 48% striking accuracy, 4.27 strikes absorbed. For Montel Jackson, 4.16 significant strikes landed per minute, 55% striking accuracy, only 1.5 strikes absorbed per minute. And then grappling, these guys are evenly matched. Montel Jackson's actually a better grappler. Brett Johns, 4.29 takedowns per 15 minutes, 52% takedown accuracy, 61% takedown defense. And Jackson betters all of those numbers. 4.84 takedowns per 15 minutes, 79% takedown accuracy, which is just phenomenal, and 70% takedown defense. So, as I mentioned, I just give the nod to Montel Jackson here. Now, when it comes to DFS, Montel Jackson is one of the most expensive fighters on this slate at 9,100. And I mean, that's well deserved, because if you see, averages 89.6 fantasy points per fight, which is solid. And one of the reasons why, even though he doesn't have a ton of finishes, is because he's just been able to so easily take down his opponents. The difference in this fight, though, is Brett Johns is a good grappler and has some decent BJJ skills himself. So I don't think, like I mentioned, I don't think that's going to be Montel Jackson's game plan. So if you need him to score a lot of points, he's going to have to do it one of two ways. Either a ton of striking output, or he's going to need to get the finish. And I just don't see Johns getting finished. If Aljo couldn't finish, Johns. If Munoz couldn't finish Johns, I don't really see Jackson finishing Johns. So it would just make it really tough for me to put Jackson in my DFS lineup. Brett Johns, on the other hand, one of the cheapest fighters, 7,100, and he averages 76 fantasy points per fight. So he's not a horrible person to put in your DFS lineup. The only thing is, if you look at his fight log, 22 fantasy points against Aljamain Sterling and only 37 fantasy points against Munoz. So if you buy in to Montel Jackson being as good as a Aljamain Sterling, Pedro Munoz like me, that makes me want to stay away from Brett Johns. And it makes sense that he's 7,100 in salary because he's such a big dog in this fight. So I get it. It's Brett Johns. A lot of people are high on him. He's a huge underdog. The money's going to come trickling in. He'll probably be pretty high owned in DFS. I say stay away. I say stay away from Brett Johns. There's guys that you could use in your lineups in the low to mid 7,000s that I think are better options. We've already discussed one of those in Davi Ramos. But yeah, I probably won't have a ton of Brett Johns exposure. I just don't see him racking up a bunch of points unless somehow he pulls out a submission. He's got to take Montel Jackson down. I don't see him doing that. So we'll move on to the next fight. Maybe Brett Johns proves me wrong. Next fight here is Joel Alvarez versus Joe Duffy. Joel Alvarez has a 16-2 record fighting out of Spain. Joe Duffy, 16-4 record fighting out of Ireland. And you should know Joe Duffy. He's been in the UFC for a while. He's most known for being the first guy to ever defeat Conor McGregor, which is crazy, the different direction their careers have gone. Joe Duffy's 32 years old. He's a veteran. Joel Alvarez, relatively young, 27 years old. Alvarez has a pretty significant size advantage in this. Alvarez is 6'3" with a 77-inch reach. Joe Duffy, 5'10", 73-inch reach. Joe Duffy trains with TriStar, so tons of talent there. GSP. And Joe Duffy has a nice boxing background. In fact, when Joe Duffy first came to the UFC, he was impressive, man. I remember watching him and being like, this is a guy that could eventually fight for a belt. He was really successful at Cage Warriors. That's where he beat Conor McGregor. And then his first two fights in the UFC, he knocked out Jake Lindsay. He was able to sub Ivan Jorge. Things were really looking good. And then he's had a streak of some tough fights. I mean, let's just be honest. Dustin Poirier lost that fight, decision. He then was able to beat Mitch Clark by a rear naked choke. And he also beat Reza Madadi, which that was a pretty impressive fight. He beat Madadi, that went the distance. He won by decision. But then his two most recent fights, and again, Duffy hasn't stayed active. In 2017, he was knocked out by James Vick. And then his last fight, which was all the way back in March of 2019, he was beat by Mark Jacasey, who's also on this card. So Mark Jacasey won that fight by decision. Joel Alvarez, on the flip side, has only had a couple UFC fights. He lost his UFC debut to Damir Ismagulov. That was by decision. And then he most recently, about a year ago, beat Danilo Belluardo, beat him TKO. I think it was ground and pound, got him on the ground and just kind of smashed him. So both these guys, we do have the ability to get some stats for them. I guess the crazy thing here to me is just how big of a favorite Joe Duffy is. He's minus 375, and Joel Alvarez is plus 285. I know Duffy's faced tougher competition, but he hasn't fought in forever, and he's coming off of 2 losses, which just scares me, and he's just disadvantaged from a size standpoint. Let's pull up the stats here, though. Maybe the stats will be a little bit more telling. I don't think they will be. Striking stats for Joe Duffy: 2.56 significant strikes landed per minute, 33% striking accuracy, 3.63 strikes absorbed. And I'm just taking a peek at Joel Alvarez's numbers, and these guys are just mirror images of each other. 2.55 significant strikes landed per minute, 33% striking accuracy, 3.44 strikes absorbed per minute. So, I mean, it's nearly identical. When it comes to grappling, neither of these guys are really grapplers. I don't even have a ton of grappling stats here for Joel Alvarez, but for Joe Duffy, 0.75 takedowns per 15 minutes, 60% takedown accuracy. So when he shoots, he is able to be successful. 64% takedown defense. It's just not Joe Duffy's game. I don't know, who knows? Maybe he's evolved with this layoff and he's going to incorporate more takedowns, which I don't think is a bad idea, because Joe Duffy does have like pretty solid BJJ skills. He's able to submit people in the UFC, which is what you want to see. Especially in this fight, when I think Joel Alvarez just has that big size advantage. And if he's able to control the distance with his jab, that could present problems for Joe Duffy. So, I don't know, maybe Joe Duffy, after a couple losses in the UFC here, has taken some time off and tried to reinvent himself. And maybe he will incorporate more takedowns and a ground game, but I don't know if that's the case. So just looking at the numbers and then looking at the betting odds, I am just completely perplexed. How is Joe Duffy minus 375? He hasn't been that successful in the UFC. Whenever he's faced tough competition, he's lost. And he rarely fights. Joel Alvarez is the bigger fighter. Joel Alvarez is the younger fighter. Joel Alvarez is the more active fighter. If I'm going to put money on a fighter in this fight, it's going to be on Joel Alvarez. I am certainly not laying $375 down to just win 100 on Joe Duffy. From a DFS perspective, Joel Alvarez is the cheapest fighter on the card, and Joe Duffy is the most expensive. Again, this is crazy. Who is paying up a $9,300 salary for Joe Duffy? The guy averages 61.3 fantasy points per fight, and it's not like he has a ton of finishes. I'm just looking at it right now. I mean, his last fight against Jacasey, he lost decision. He was KO'd by Vic. He did beat the Madadi, as I pointed out. That was impressive. But that was by decision. He only put up 67 points. So I just don't see where this $9,300 salary is coming from. It's crazy to me. Joel Alvarez, being the cheapest fighter at $6,900, is actually someone I really like. And I will have a ton of exposure to him. Not because I think he's got a ton of finishing potential. I mean, he did win by finish in his last fight. But just because I think that this is a fight that he has a really good chance of winning. And if he wins, who knows? With the long layoff for Joe Duffy, might be able to finish him here. So at $6,900, a guy with a 16-2 record, UFC experience, more active fighter, bigger fighter, I'm putting that in my DFS lineup all day. So I think you guys should follow me, because I've been on a little bit of a hot streak. So get Joel Alvarez in your lineup. Next fight here is Grant Dawson versus Nad Narimani, which I believe this has become a catchweight fight. These guys are both featherweights, but this fight's taking place at 150 pounds, at least what I'm looking at here on Tapology, which is actually really good if you're a Grant Dawson fan, because he's had trouble making weight in the past, and he's a solid featherweight. For 145 pounds, he's 5'10", 72-inch reach, but just built really solid. He's got a 15-1 record, very impressive. Going up against the English Nad Narimani, who has a record of 12-3. Both these guys have some UFC experience under their belt. Grant Dawson was discovered on the Contender Series, where he does what he always does, is just come forward with some relentless pressure, land some big strikes, take the fight to the ground, and either ground and pound you or submit you. And that's what we've seen from Grant Dawson so far in the UFC. 4 months ago against Darrick Minner, subbed him, rear naked choke. A year ago, subbed Mike Trizano, rear naked choke. And that was Mike Trizano's first loss. Juicy J, Julian Erosa, won that fight by decision, just kept constant pressure and was able to really put it on Juicy J. For Nad Narimani, looking back at his most recent UFC fights, he's coming off of a loss to Mike Grundy. He was knocked out. That was about a year ago. Won by decision against Anderson Dos Santos. I don't know how impressive that is. Anderson Dos Santos, I don't think is the most impressive fighter. And then in his first fight, which I would say is probably his most impressive victory, it's now been 2 years, he beat Khalid Taha by decision, just a unanimous decision victory. And Taha had a like 12-1 or 11-1 record at the time, so that was pretty impressive. This fight's interesting to me. Grant Dawson, the minus 265 favorite, so he's a pretty significant favorite, but that line has been adjusted. Some money has come in on Narimani. Not really sure why. I mean, Narimani fights for Team Alpha Male now, so I mean, with the coronavirus, I don't know how much work he's getting, but you know, they have some solid featherweights over there. And Grant Dawson's young, right? So even though he has some UFC fights and experience, Juicy J, how many stints has that guy had in the UFC? Mike Trizano, an Ultimate Fighter guy. Darrick Minner. I mean, Minner has a ton of pro experience, but you know, Grant Dawson, as great as he's looked in the UFC, he doesn't have that signature win yet. And I don't think beating Narimani would be a signature win either, but I definitely lean, I would lean Grant Dawson here. I like Grant Dawson here at minus 265, and that number could continue to go down. You know, if you're getting Grant Dawson at minus 200, I think that's solid. I feel comfortable laying some money on that. I want to pull up some stats though on UFC's website here. Grant Dawson, 3.48 significant strikes per minute, 48% striking accuracy, 2.15 strikes absorbed. Narimani, 3.8 significant strikes landed per minute, 43% striking accuracy, 2.8 strikes absorbed. So, yeah, I mean, none of those numbers really stick out to me. Both these guys are pretty average when it comes to their striking. The numbers that are going to stick out to me are the grappling numbers for Grant Dawson. 5 takedowns per 15 minutes, 48% takedown accuracy, 33% takedown defense, and 2.5 subs per 15 minutes. Nad Narimani, 2.64 takedowns per 15 minutes, so that's pretty good. 41% takedown accuracy and 75% takedown defense. That number's really nice, actually. But, again, who has he fought in the UFC? He hasn't really fought anybody of any note he hasn't fought like a big name in the UFC. I mean, the guys he's fought, Anderson Dos Santos, just a nobody. Mike Grundy knocked him out. Mike Grundy's not like this, you know, top-ranked featherweight. So I think Grant Dawson shouldn't have too much trouble taking this fight to the mat. I think he should be able to take Nad Narimani to the ground at will here, which is why I'm really liking Dawson, and which is also why I'm liking Dawson from a DFS perspective. Dawson is one of the more pricey fighters here. He is the second most expensive fighter, coming in at a $9,200 salary. But Dawson averages 106 fantasy points per fight. And, you know, he's undefeated in the UFC. Numbers look really good. 104 fantasy points, 111 fantasy points, 106 fantasy points. In DraftKings, those takedowns and advances are worth a lot of points. You know, 6 takedowns, 3 takedowns, 6 advances, 4 advances, 5 advances. That's what I'm chasing here. I mean, yeah, a submission or even a knockout would just be icing on the cake. But if Grant Dawson, I mean, this guy's super active. He's going to take you down and advance all night, especially if you can't stop him. So the submission would be icing on the cake here, but I think he's going to be able to just really out-grapple Narimani. I won't have any Narimani shares. I'll definitely have some Dawson, especially on a card like this where I don't think there's a ton of finishing potential, as I had already mentioned before with a lot of these fighters. So Narimani, 7,000. He is the second cheapest fighter. 64.8 fantasy points per fight. It's actually not horrible. He put up 101 against Taha, 83 against Dos Santos. So there's some solid output there. 84 significant strikes. But, you know, his most recent fight against Grundy, where he was knocked out, only 11 fantasy points. Yeah, won't have too much exposure to Narimani. I really like Dawson. I like Dawson's potential to put up a lot of points on a slate where there aren't a ton of finishers. So get Grant Dawson in your lineup. For sure, he's worth paying up for. Moving on to our next fight here in the light heavyweight division, we have Khadis Ibragimov versus Roman Dolidze. Dolidze? I believe it's Dolidze. Two European fighters here. Khadis Ibragimov, he's got a record of 8-2. He has had 2 UFC fights, so a little bit of UFC experience for him, but we're both pretty tough losses. I know the most recent one was to Ed Herman. He just looked horrible in that fight. And then he also lost to Da Un Jung, standing guillotine choke. So, man, Ibragimov has had it rough in the UFC so far. On the flip side, Roman Dolidze, he's 6-0, perfect as a pro. Now, he is making his UFC debut here, but he has some experience in the WWFC, which is a solid organization. And this guy is got some serious, powerful striking ability. Just looking 6-0 and a lot of finishes here. His 5 most recent fights, Rezi Del Campe subbed him via heel hook. Ilyas Abdulayev beat him rear naked choke. Amirali Zeroev, I don't even know how to pronounce that guy's name. I apologize. And that was his first professional fight. He knocked him out. Then he beat Eder De Souza, who had a record of 15-4, knocked him out. And his most recent fight, which was, this guy's hasn't been active, and we're going to talk about that because it's almost been 2 years since he's had a professional fight. But his most recent fight was against Mikhail Pasternak, who had a record of 13-3, and he knocked him out with a spinning back fist. I was able to watch that fight on YouTube. I actually saw a couple of Roman's fights, and they're impressive. His striking is a little bit unorthodox. I don't know if he has the best technique. I think he's able to overcome that flaw with just the amount of power that he has in his hands. Like, if he connects, you don't want to be on the other side of that. He just hits hard. Everything he does is with tenacity and aggression. So I like to see that. Sometimes it scares me. I watched some of his takedown attempts where he's going in for a double leg or a single leg. I'm just like, that seems reckless. If someone just times that and comes up the middle with a knee, could flatline Roman Dolidze here. But I just look at this fight and I'm in agreement with Vegas. Actually, I'm surprised the odds aren't more than they are. I mean, Dolidze is minus 185. And Ibragimov is plus 150. Ibragimov has looked so horrible in the UFC. That shocks me. Now, I know he has UFC experience, so he has the experience advantage. And they're basically both the same size. I think Dolidze is built a little bit more muscular, a little bit more solid. Both guys are 6'3". And Delize hasn't been active. He hasn't fought, but he popped for performance-enhancing drugs. He's had a bunch of injuries, so that kind of explains why he hasn't been too active. But back to Ibragimov, I mean, that fight against Ed Herman just shows you why I could never bet on a fighter like Ibragimov. You're fighting Ed Herman, who I know is a wily, experienced veteran, but the guy's like 40 years old. If you would think someone had a stamina advantage, it would be the 25-year-old Ibragimov. Ibragimov gassed out like within the first 3 minutes of the fight. He tried to clinch with Herman, had him up against the cage, which wasn't smart, by the way. Herman excels in that area. And Herman just kind of withered the storm, was able to land some good clinch work, elbows, busted Ibragimov's nose, and Ibragimov was basically useless beyond the first 3 minutes of that fight. He just there was no urgency, no power behind his striking. He basically became a punching bag to Ed Herman. And then before that, he was subbed. Standing guillotine choke. So, I mean, that's kind of an embarrassing way to go out. So, I just don't see a ton of promise for Ibragimov, and this is probably going to be his last fight in the UFC. I think Delize comes out here, just all he needs is one good shot, one big shot. He lands that on Ibragimov, knocks him out, and it's game over. So I really like Delize minus 185. That's a no-brainer for me. In fact, that might just, those odds are kind of disrespectful to Delize's talent. I know he's not super experienced. I know he's not active, but just watch his highlights, man. Just watch his highlights. This guy has legitimate power. Really like him in this fight. And I also really like him in DFS, by the way. And for more of the same reasons why I like guys like Dawson. Because on this card, there are not a ton of fighters that are expected to finish their fights. You know, a lot of these fights Vegas thinks will go the distance. One of the fights that they don't think will go the distance is Delize versus Ibragimov. So you have to get Delize in your lineup, because at 8,900, we already talked about some of the other fighters in that high 8, low 9 area. Joe Duffy, don't see a ton of finishing potential. Montel Jackson, I really like him as a fighter. Is he going to finish Brett Johns? Probably not. Alexandre Pantoja, good fighter, a lot of output. He's got a tough opponent. We're going to talk about that fight. He's fighting Oscar Askarov. Dude's undefeated. And those guys they're 125ers, so you don't see a ton of finishes in that division. Sarukian, we talked about him. Sarukian at 8,700. You're going to pay up against Davi Ramos. We haven't seen a finish from Sarukian yet in the UFC, and if you expect him to go out there and knock out Davi Ramos, I mean, could it happen? Yes. Is it likely? No. He's certainly not going to sub Davi Ramos. So when you're looking at that high 8, low 9 range, I actually don't see a ton of options there. The options that I do see would be Dawson and Roman Delize. So I'm going to have him in my lineup. He will certainly be in my lineup, and I expect a knockout from him. And if he gets that knockout, then he'll certainly pay up that 8,900 price point. Ibragimov, I'm just going to stay away from across the board. There's nothing you could do to convince me to have him in a lineup. It's just what I've seen from him is just, I don't like fighters that are going to gas out, because even if they come out and have some success early, you can't count on that carrying through in the second and third rounds. So if Ibragimov comes out and shows some potential and is exciting in that first round and racks up some points, well, that's all well and good, but is he going to carry that over into the second and third round? And so far in the UFC, he doesn't have the ability to do that. So we talked about on Wednesday night why I didn't like Al Hassan. And I said Al Hassan's going to throw some bombs early And he could finish Laziz, but if he doesn't finish Laziz, he will lose that fight. And I had Laziz in my main lineup for that reason. Low ownership, a guy that was the second cheapest fighter on the slate, and a guy that had a path to victory. The path to victory there is wither the storm. You're the more technical fighter. Just outpoint him from there. And that's exactly what happened. I see the same thing here with Ibragimov. And Ibragimov certainly doesn't have Al Hassan's power, but he's a guy that's going to come out, try to swing with some big hooks, or attempt to take Dolidze down. He's going to use up that gas tank. And from there on out, Dolidze has a huge advantage. Probably has an advantage whether or not stamina comes into play, because I think Dolidze is just a heavier hitter. So really like Dolidze in this. Avoid Ibragimov in all of your cards. He's probably my #1 fade. Move on to the next fight here. Alexandre Pantoja versus Askar Askarov in the flyweight division, 125 pounds. This fight will probably be one of the most competitive fights on the card, so I am super excited about this fight. Both these guys have some UFC experience here. We'll start off with Pantoja. He has a 22-4 record. He's 5'5", 68-inch reach. He will be fighting Askar Askarov, who is 11-0-1, undefeated. 5'6", 67-inch reach. Vegas likes Pantoja in this one. He's a -185 favorite. And Askar Askarov is a +150 underdog. Interesting odds there. I would think it would be a little bit closer. So let's look at kind of what's been going on with these guys in their more recent UFC fights. I think Askarov's only had 2 fights in the UFC. And talk about tough fights. His first UFC fight was against Brandon Moreno. I remember that fight. I didn't even know who Askarov was at the time. Brandon Moreno was a pretty big favorite there, and it ended up being a split decision draw. It was a close fight. I remember that fight. It kind of went back and forth. Askarov really held his own in that, and he impressed me. 5 months ago, Askarov fought Tim Elliott and won that fight by decision unanimously, but he had Tim Elliott in some pretty bad spots in that fight, and really he answered any questions when it came to grappling. And I'm not surprised. He's a Russian fighter. Those guys have grappling backgrounds, but Tim Elliott's one of the best grapplers in the 125-pound division. We saw that he was able to use that against Benoit just on Wednesday night. So it was impressive to see Askarov hold his own in that department. For Pantoja, who is a ultimate fighter, veteran, they have that common opponent in Brandon Moreno. Pantoja was able to beat Brandon Moreno by decision. Now, that was 2 years ago. After that fight, he fought Ulka Sasaki, and he subbed him, rear naked choke. He also was able to knock out Wilson Hayes, and that was crazy. I mean, Hayes he's a BJJ guy, but he does have powerful hands. So to see for Pantoja to knock out Hayes, that was impressive. Pantoja has a loss a little bit less than a year ago to Davison Figueiredo, who of course is on the main event against Joe B. And Figueiredo wasn't able to finish Pantoja. And Figueiredo's got heavy hands. So Pantoja, I remember that fight. Pantoja was able to hold his own in that fight. So both these fighters, man, in the recent fights where they didn't get victories, it's not like they went out there and just got pummeled. They put on solid performances, which is what you want to see. And then 6 months ago, Pantoja knocked out Matt Schnell, overhand right. That was easy money, all day easy money. I don't get the whole Matt Schnell hype train. He doesn't impress me. Pantoja just has some vicious striking. He's got those leg kicks, those low calf kicks. He'll whip those across, kind of similar to how Jose Aldo had been doing it for years and years. And you know, like I said, minus 185 for Pantoja. It's he's a pretty big favorite considering he's fighting an undefeated fighter. I like Askarov at plus 150. I really do. I think it's pretty solid. I just want to pull up some stats. We'll take a look at the striking stats for Askarov. 3.43 significant strikes landed per minute, 48% striking accuracy, 2.7 strikes absorbed. For Pantoja, more active, 4.58 significant strikes landed per minute, 47% striking accuracy, 3.53 strikes absorbed per minute. And when it comes to grappling, I would say both these guys are strike first fighters. Like these guys are going to prefer, I think both of them would prefer to keep it standing. I say that, but if Pantoja lands some heavy calf kicks on Askarov, he might try to switch it up. I mean, but both of these guys are solid on the ground, and they're decent when it comes to grappling as well. Just looking at the numbers, Pantoja averages a takedown per 15 minutes, 35% takedown accuracy, 60% takedown defense. Askarov, 2 takedowns per 15 minutes, 22% takedown accuracy, and 66% takedown defense. So statistically, these guys are pretty close as well. It's tough. This is going to be probably the closest fight on the card. I mean, I lean Pantoja. I think he's probably the more talented and more skilled fighter. But I don't think he's that much more talented and that much more skilled that I'd be willing to bet him at minus 185 or minus 200. I think that's just disrespectful to Askarov. Like, if I'm going to get an undefeated fighter, 11-0-1, who has some UFC experience, he's gone the distance with Brandon Moreno, he's gone the distance with Tim Elliott, at plus 150, plus 175, like, those odds are too good to pass up. Those odds are just too good to pass up. So I don't know if I would bet this one way or the other, but if I had to bet it, gun to my head, I'm probably just going to put a little bit of money on Askarov. And that's kind of how I feel about this fight from a DFS perspective as well. Pantoja at 8,800. I mean, Pantoja always has solid output. Like, he's going to land significant strikes. He's going to attempt some takedowns. So in fantasy, he always has an opportunity to put up a ton of points, especially if he gets a finish. I don't think he's going to get a finish. I would be so shocked, so surprised if he got a finish in this fight. But he could still, especially if he wins the fight, put up anywhere from 75 to 85 points, which isn't great at an 8,800 price point. But if you're confident he's going to win, it's not the worst thing. With Askarov, I don't think I'm going to have a ton of exposure to him either, because I don't think he finishes Pantoja. But you could do worse at 7,400 because he has a chance of winning, and he'll land some strikes, and he should be able to get some takedowns as well. So, you know, I feel the same way about Askarov as I feel about Pantoja here, is that whoever wins is probably going to end up with anywhere from 70 to 85 points. The thing is, if you're going to take 70 to 85 points, you might as well do that paying 7,400 rather than 8,800 for Pantoja. This one was really one that I struggled with, because when I was putting together what I think will be, you know, my main lineup, it was difficult for me. The last kind of spot in my card, I was either going to go with Davi Ramos or Oscar Askarov. The only reason why I went with Davi Ramos is just because I feel like he has more finishing potential. So if I might, and in all honesty, I might just enter that same card in multiple tournaments and just swap out Ramos for Askarov. just because I feel like his ceiling might not be as high as Ramos's, but his floor is certainly higher. If you're playing in tournaments, you're looking for that ceiling. If you're playing in cash, then I would say go with Askarov. So Askarov's not going to be in my main lineup, but I will have exposure to him. Alrighty, moving on to the next fight. Ariane Lipski versus Luana Carolina. Both these girls are flyweights, and they're both from Brazil. Carolina only has one UFC fight, so we'll be able to get some stats, and she was also on the Contender Series. Lipski, on the other hand, she fought in KSW, which is, pretty legit card over in Europe. Or not card, organization. And then she's had 3 fights in the UFC where she's 1-2. So Lipski's professional record 12-5. Carolina's is 6-1. Looking at their most recent fights for Lipski, 7 months ago she beat Isabella de Padua by decision. A year ago she lost to Molly McCann. That was by decision. And then she lost to Joanne Calderwood by decision. So some pretty game opponents in Calderwood and Molly McCann. For Carolina, she's on a 5-fight win streak. Now, some of those fights were against just straight garbage opponents, girls that only had 1 or 2 victories in Brazil. But she was able to beat Mabeli Lima by decision on the Contender Series, and Lima had a 7-0 record. And then she beat Priscilla Cachoeira a year ago in her UFC debut. Cachoeira had an 8-2 record, and she was able to put a beating on Cachoeira. Just landed a ton of strikes. It was pretty impressive, but I'm not a big Cachoeira believer myself, so I kind of expected it. In fact, I called it in that fight. I really liked Carolina as a live dog in that fight. Here, this fight is just a pick'em. I mean, they're so even across the board. They're both 5'6". Carolina does have a little bit of a reach advantage. She does have long arms. But the reason why I think Vegas views this as even, and why I view it as even as well, is because you have 2 different styles here. I think Lipski, she's the violence queen. She's going to come running in and try to just drop some wild hooks and hopefully drop Carolina. Whereas Carolina, she's like the longer, more rangy fighter. So I don't think Carolina is a good enough fighter at this point in her career to control the distance. So I think this is going to just turn into a scrap the more that I think about it. I don't know who wins this fight. I feel like whoever is worse defensively loses. And I just haven't seen enough of Carolina to say that she's not a great defensive fighter, because she hasn't really fought anyone good yet. So Lipski will be her toughest test, but I don't even think Lipski's that great of a fighter either. This is a tough one. I don't know if I would bet this fight either way. In fact, my track record with the female fights haven't been good. Last card I said Belbita's got a boxing advantage. She should certainly be able to beat Jojo, and what happens? She gets submitted, armbarred. And then Molly McCann, the only loss that I had on my lineup. Really liked her to beat Tyler Santos. And what happens? She gets dominated for 3 rounds. So if there's ever a time to not listen to my analysis, it's probably for a fight like this. Evenly matched 2 females that have similar styles, similar backgrounds. This one's a total toss-up. So I'm not going to be putting any money on this fight. And then from a DraftKings perspective, DFS, Carolina's 7,900. Lipski's 8,300. So, high 7, low 8. Not surprising, because they're basically a pick'em. I am surprised that Lipski is the low 8, though. She's the favorite according to DraftKings. I would have no ownership of her. I probably won't have ownership of either of these fighters. But if I had to pick one fighter versus another, it would probably be Carolina. Just because we've seen in her one UFC fight against Cachoeira, she landed 111 strikes. Now, Cachoeira stinks. She's just a trash can. So I don't know how much stock I can put in that, but at least we know that Carolina can at least strike with a high amount of volume, and the potential is there for her to do that. But if you watch, and I've watched a ton of Carolina. I watched her on the Contender Series. I watched her against Cachoeira. I've watched her highlights before she came to the UFC and fought nobody. There's just something about her striking that just doesn't look natural. She's really long and she's kind of loopy, and it's like she doesn't distribute her weight properly for her lower body, I guess is the best way that I could explain it. She fights like a girl. I hate to say that, but when I say that, what I mean is like an amateur. It's just really reachy, loopy, not a ton of power. She does generate some power on her knees. So if Lipsky comes in on the inside and tries to close some of that distance, Carolina could definitely land her with a knee right up the middle. But when it just comes to striking, it's really weird to look at. It's not technical at all. I mean, she'll throw the hands, but she's not going to knock anybody out with one shot. If she beats you by TKO, it's just death by 1,000 stabs. It's just boop 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 boop. So I probably did way too much analysis on this fight. At the end of the day, I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to it. I might have a lineup out there that has Carolina, but I'd rather have Ramos at 7,500. I'd rather have Askarov at 7,400. So I'm going to be staying away. All right, moving on to the next fight here. We have Mark Jacasey versus Rafael Fiziev, and that fight will be taking place in the lightweight division, which of course is 155 pounds. This is a good one here. I really like Mark Jacasey. I feel like he's always an exciting fighter, win or lose. And it's nice to see that Mark Jacasey's back on a win streak after having a few tough fights there. So Mark Jacasey's 14-3, fighting out of England, going up against the Kyrgyzstanian, if that's a word, Rafael Fiziev. And Fiziev's got a record of 7-1. Did take that one loss in his first UFC debut. Looking at the odds here, Jacasey's a -160 favorite. Fiziev's plus 130. And height reach, Jacasey has an advantage in both areas. 5'10" to Fiziev's 5'8", 73-inch reach to 71.5-inch reach for Fiziev. So, and two really tough teams, by the way. Let's point that out. Mark Jacasey's fighting with American Top Team. You have Tiger Muay Thai for Fiziev. So these guys are getting trained up, that's for sure. Let's just take a look at what Jacasey's been up to in his last 5 fights in the UFC. As I mentioned, he is on a winning streak again, which is nice. But before that, he's won his last 2 fights. Before that, he lost 3 in a row, dating back to 3 years ago when he lost split decision to Jakar Close. 2.5 years ago, he was subbed, guillotine choked by Dan Hooker. At one point, that was kind of a shock. Now you're looking at it and you're like, all right, makes sense. Dan Hooker's a total beast. He also lost decision to Nasrat Haqparast. And Haqparast, even though he didn't look that great in his last fight, is still a tough opponent. I mean, he's still he's still someone I would consider a prospect in the UFC. So his 2 most recent victories, a year ago against Joe Duffy. Didn't have a tough time with Joe Duffy at all. Won that by decision unanimously. And then he also beat Lando Venata, which is probably his most impressive victory in the UFC so far. That took place 9 months ago. Won that victory, or won that decision unanimously, which was impressive. That was a good fight too. You know, Benavidez, super creative striker, and so is Jacasey. So you knew it was going to be some unorthodox, spinny stuff going on there. For Rafael Fiziev, he's only had 2 UFC fights. As I mentioned, he did lose his UFC debut to Magomed Mustafayev? I always mess up Magomed Mustafayev's name. Anyway, he was knocked out by spinning back kick. And that's pretty funny because that is definitely part of Jacasey's arsenal. And then 8 months ago, Fiziev did beat Alex White by decision. And that's where I really had to pump the brakes on Fiziev, because Alex White to me is not the greatest UFC prospect. I mean, the guy has a 13-5 record, and I don't think Alex White had a ton of UFC experience in that fight either. Let me just check. Actually, Alex White has been in the UFC for a while. Where have I been? Just hasn't been an active fighter, really, if you look. 2014, 2016. Did have 2 fights in 2017. All right, well, my mistake. Either way, that victory over Alex White wasn't too impressive in my book. I was expecting Fiziev to knock him out, and he didn't. White was able to go the distance. So both these guys have finishing potential. I mean, we haven't really seen that from Jacasey recently, but we haven't seen it from Fiziev recently either. Outside of when he fought for Titan, you know, before he came to the UFC, and he was undefeated, and he was on that nice little run there, showing some legitimate power. And for Jacasey, he's been a little bit of a decision merchant as of late. His last victory where it didn't go to a decision was Teemu Packalén. And that was all the way back in 2017, and he just destroyed him. Oh my goodness, I remember that fight. Poor Teemu. Just completely rocked him. So, yeah, Jacasey's been a little bit of a decision merchant lately, but, I mean, tough competition when you're talking about Lando Venata, Joe Duffy, Nasrat Haqparast, Dan Hooker, Drakkar Klose. I mean, the experience that he has against top competition versus Fiziev, there's just a major difference there. So I look at that minus 160. Those odds are just crazy to me. They're crazy. I love Jacasey in this. He might be, I mean, I would really be comfortable putting up some decent amount of money on Jacasey in this fight at minus 160. That's almost disrespectful to him because he's on this winning streak. He only has those 3 losses that he took against tough competition in the UFC. And he's fighting a guy that just hasn't looked that impressive so far in the UFC and doesn't have nearly the same amount of competition. Is there a path to victory for Fiziev here? I think there is. Fiziev has to pressure Jacasey, right? That's what Jacasey doesn't like. He doesn't like when he's pressured. If you give Jacasey space and time, he's going to punish you every time. So Fiziev has to be aggressive. The problem with that is if he's aggressive, he's going to be susceptible to taking a big shot, right? Is he going to be willing to take one to give one? And I don't know if that's the smartest strategy. It might be the only strategy because you're not going to outpoint Jacasey, but it's going to leave you susceptible to getting knocked out, which we saw happen with Magomed Mustafayev. I think I did a better job pronouncing his name there. So I want to just pull up some of the stats here. Jacasey, 2.86 significant strikes landed per minute. 37% striking accuracy, 2.41 strikes absorbed per minute. For Fiziev, 4.08 significant strikes landed per minute. With a 50% striking accuracy, it's pretty solid, but he does absorb 3.96 strikes per minute. When it comes to grappling, Jacasey, 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes, 40% takedown accuracy, 64% takedown defense. For Fiziev, 0.9 takedowns per 15 minutes, 100% takedown accuracy, 100% takedown defense. I mean, again, those numbers aren't really super accurate because, I don't want to say accurate, but it's just a couple of UFC fights. This was one that should stay standing. Unless Jacasey, for some reason, decides to take it down, it could be as a result of the pressure. But I think this stays standing. I just think Jacasey has such a big advantage here, so I really like him. Definitely going to put some money on him. And then for DFS, even though Jacasey has had a ton of decisions, and that usually scares me from a DFS perspective, but we've already seen Fiziev knocked out in the UFC, and the level of competition that Jacasey's faced compared to Fiziev, I think this is actually like a step down for Jacasey. I would almost argue that, Venata, Haqparast, Hooker, Closa, those guys are all better fighters than Fiziev. So if he was able to win some of those fights by decision and land a decent amount of significant strikes, then I think he should have no problem with Fiziev here. And his last two fights, 73 points against Venata, 93 points against Duffy. I think we're going to see the same thing here for Jacasey. He's either going to get a knockout and put up around 100 points, or he's going to win by decision, and you're looking at 75 to 90 points. And that's all I need from him at that 8,500 price point, because there's not a ton of great options there. You could pay up for Sergey Spivak and hope for a finish. Stay away from Lipsky. You have Gastelum and Hermanson in the low 8,000s. We're going to talk about that fight. That's up next. Sarukian, don't love him there. Albazi. So I guess if you're going to spend money on someone in the mid-8s, it's going to come down to Jacasey or Albazi. And I just lean Jacasey because I'm just more comfortable with a guy that I've seen and a guy that's fought tough competition. All right, so moving on to the co-main event here in the middleweight weight class. Can't wait for this one. Jack Hermansson versus Kelvin Gastelum. Jack Hermansson's 20-5 plus 100, so this is basically a pick'em. Fighting out of Sweden. He's 6'1" with a 77.5-inch reach. Huge size advantage for Hermansson in this fight. Kelvin Gastelum, 16-5. He is the slight favorite at minus 130. 5'9" height, 71.5-inch reach. So a 6-inch reach disadvantage for Gastelum. That's rough. All right, let's just take a look at some of the most recent fights. Jack Hermansson was KO'd about 9 months ago by Jared Cannonier. I mean, what can you do about it? Jared Cannonier is difficult to take down. He's a big boy. You know that's where Hermansson wants to take the fight. Couldn't take him down, and he got knocked out by the better striker. Before that, though, he was on a nice little win streak. He beat Jacare. I actually was able to attend that fight live in person. It was awesome. Just out-grappled one of the best grapplers in MMA in Jacare. He subbed David Branch. That was impressive as well. David Branch is like an enigma to me. He's a guy that I thought would have had way more success in the UFC. He had some tough draws. But Hermansson made that one look easy. Just subbed him, guillotine choke, lights out. Before that, guillotine choke on Gerald Meerschaert. So you're seeing a pattern here. Guillotine choke, guillotine choke. Like, Jack Hermansson has probably the best guillotine in all of the UFC. And then he also beat Talis Leites, which was 2 years ago, just ground and pound, got him on the ground, TKO. For Gastelum, he's on a 2-fight losing streak here. So a year ago, he fought for the title against Israel Adesanya, in which was just a classic fight, great back and forth fight. Lost that fight, unanimous decision. And then 8 months ago, he fought Darren Till, and he lost that fight as well. Split decision. That one was much closer. But there was a lot of hype for that fight, but it wasn't the most exciting fight. It was kind of both fighters just fought cautiously in that one, which made sense because Till was knocked out a few times. Gastelum got pretty touched up by Adesanya. The 2 fights before the Adesanya title fight was 2 years ago against Michael Bisping, knocked out Michael Bisping, former belt holder, and then common opponent Jacare won that fight, split decision, and that was close, man. I thought Jacare won that fight against Gastelum. This is what I think about this fight. This fight is going to go one of 2 ways. The first way is Jack Hermansson is able to take Gastelum down, and Hermansson ground and pounds him and probably finishes him from the ground, more than likely by submission. The other way that this fight could go is Gastelum is able to stuff the takedown of Hermansson, forces Hermansson to fight him on the feet, and Gastelum just is a better striker and counter-strikes him and probably has a chance of knocking out Hermansson. So those are the 2 ways that I see it. I really do think that a finish is likely in this fight. I just don't know who's going to finish who. If I had to lean one way or the other, I would probably lean Hermansson. Let's take a look at the stats just to get a little bit more information here on this fight. Jack Hermansson, 5.13 significant strikes landed per minute, 48% striking accuracy, 2.56 strikes absorbed. Those striking numbers actually surprise me because I just don't view Hermansson as a striker. I think he's just more so striking to set up a takedown. For Kelvin Gastelum, 3.75 significant strikes landed per minute, 43% striking accuracy, and 3 strikes absorbed per minute. Not great numbers, really. Not horrible. I mean, they're average numbers, but, for someone who's touted to be, this guy fought for a title. I would expect better numbers there. When it comes to grappling, Jack Hermansson, 2.23 takedowns per 15 minutes, 36% takedown accuracy, 77% takedown defense. Also, 0.7 subs per 15 minutes. Gastelum, though he does have a wrestling base, he's not very offensive with his takedowns. 0.8 takedowns per 15 minutes, 35% takedown accuracy, 62% takedown defense. So I guess I look at it this way. I think Kelvin Gastelum's overrated. And I think he's overrated because of the division that he fights in. He's 5'9" with a 71-inch reach fighting as a middleweight. He is not a middleweight fighter. He should be fighting at welterweight, but he can't make the weight. So that's why he has to fight at middleweight. And I think some of those victories that seemed impressive at the time were really not that impressive. Beating Michael Bisping, I know he had the belt at one point, but who was in the later stages of his career, I don't find that to be that impressive. His split decision win versus Jacare, I mean, it was impressive, but it was impressive that he was able to snuff the takedowns, but we've seen Jacare is not the same Jacare that he once was. He lost to Gastelum, he beat Weidman, who doesn't beat Weidman. He lost to Hermansson, he lost to Jan Blachowicz, so it's clear that Jacare is not the same Jacare. That victory by Gastelum's not impressive. But the one fight that I want to talk about, because I think it draws parallels to what's going to happen on Saturday night, is the fight against Chris Weidman back in 2017. Chris Weidman has no chin. Absolutely no chin. And he fought Kelvin Gastelum after getting knocked out by Gegard Mousasi, after getting knocked out by Yoel Romero, after getting knocked out by Luke Rockhold. And he was able to survive against Kelvin Gastelum and choke him out with an arm triangle choke. That's all I need to know. Because if that Kelvin Gastelum shows up against Hermansson, the same thing's going to occur. He's going to get choked out. And the reason why Weidman was able to survive that fight against Gastelum was because he had such a size advantage. In fact, let me just pull it up. Weidman 6'2", 78-inch reach. Jack Hermansson 6'1", 78-inch reach. So if I'm betting this fight, I like Hermansson plus 100. I'd put a little bit of money on it, nothing too major. From a DFS perspective, these guys are really close in salary. Gastelum's 8,200, Hermansson's 8,000. I could see myself having ownership in both of these guys, honestly, because I do think that this is a fight that's has a chance for a finish, which, like I've mentioned a million times now, I'll keep mentioning it. There's not a ton of those fights on this card. So Gastelum, Hermansson, they're interchangeable. You can mix and match, diversify your lineups. I lean Hermansson. That's why I think he's going to win the fight. But I could see myself having a little bit of exposure to both. Now in my main card, not going to have either of these guys. Why? Because it's such a close fight, and it could go either way, and it could be a finish either way. I'm not comfortable taking a goose egg for someone I'm paying $8K for. Mid sevens, that's one thing, but $8K, I don't know. I don't want to take a goose egg there, so won't have either of those guys in my main lineup. Probably have exposure to both of them somewhere down the line, but I lean Hermansson. All right, so moving on to the main event here, we've got Deiveson Figueiredo versus Joseph Benavidez 2, as this is a rematch. And of course, these guys are fighting for the flyweight belt. First time these guys faced each other, which was about 4 months ago, Deiveson Figueiredo was able to knock out Joe B. So Figueiredo is 18-1. He's the minus 230 favorite, 5'5", 68-inch reach. Joseph Benavidez, 28-6, plus 180, slight underdog there. 5'4" height, 65-inch reach. So Figueiredo's got a little bit of a size advantage in this one. Joe B, one of the smaller fighters in the UFC. Outside of Figueiredo knocking out Joe B last time these guys met, which, how much stake do you want to put in to the fact that Deiveson Figueiredo was unable to make weight, which is why he doesn't have the belt, which is why this fight is happening again? Did that extra 5 pounds that he didn't have to cut, was that enough to power him to knock out Joe B? I don't know if I buy into that narrative. Joe B, he's 35 years old now, man, and he's been a fan favorite for a while. He's a good fighter, but he's coming up really on the end, in my opinion, especially in the 125 weight division, where these guys are small, agile, quick, and you don't see a lot of older fighters in those small weight classes like you do in heavyweight, sometimes in light heavyweight. So, just taking a look at the last 5 fights for Figueiredo. 2 years ago, he KO'd John Moraga. I think it was a body punch too. And then Hussier Formiga did beat Figueiredo. That's the only loss on his record, which is crazy. And I remember that fight. It was close. Formiga got the nod unanimously, but it is what it is. Alexandre Pantoja, he beat him about a year ago. Again, that was by decision. That was impressive for Pantoja, but Figueiredo did get the best of him. Just landed heavier shots. He subbed Tim Elliott, guillotine choke, 9 months ago. And then, of course, as I mentioned, he knocked out Joe B in his most recent fight. Joe B on the other side, he beat Hussier Formiga, knocked him out KO about a year ago. He beat Dustin Ortiz, unanimous decision. and he also TKO'd Alex Perez, ground and pound, that was impressive. And then Sergio Pettis, he lost that fight, split decision. I didn't really agree with that one. I remember watching that one about 2 years ago. Joe B won that fight. Anyway, this is my take on this fight. Minus 230, I'm cool with that. I'm willing to put even more money on Figueiredo. I think he just repeats what happened during the first fight. I don't see how Joe B could be any better. He's just a little bit older. Joe B's had a ton of injuries. Love the guy. Married to Megan O'Leary. Represents Team Alpha Male. He's a great guy, but I just don't see where he will have an advantage in this fight against Figueiredo. Figueiredo's just a better striker in my opinion. In fact, let's pull up the stats before I start getting all crazy with it. Figueiredo versus Joe B. Figueiredo 2.54 strikes, significant strikes landed per minute. 52% striking accuracy, 2.76 strikes absorbed. Whereas Joe B, 3.53 significant strikes landed per minute, 34% striking accuracy, and 2.55 strikes absorbed per minute. So their striking numbers are pretty close, but you do see some differences, right? So Joe B's got more output, but he's way less accurate on his striking. I mean, that's no disrespect to Joe B's striking. It's actually pretty solid. 34% isn't a horrible number. But when you compare it to Deiveson Figueiredo's 52% striking accuracy, not a ton of output, but when he throws with authority, and he's gonna put power behind those shots. So, which is why he has finishes on his record. When you look at the grappling, 1.81 takedowns for Figueiredo per 15 minutes, 50% takedown accuracy, 61% takedown defense. Is able to pull subs, right? 2.4 submissions every 15 minutes. For Joe B, 1.5 takedowns per 15 minutes, 30% takedown accuracy, 65% takedown defense is pretty solid numbers. I don't see this fight really ever getting to the ground. Joe B doesn't want it to go to the ground. Figueiredo's BJJ is solid. So I think this is what we're going to see here is one of two things. In both scenarios, I think this fight stays standing. But I think what's going to happen is either Figueiredo finishes Joe B like he did 4 months ago, or if Joe B wins, he's going to have to outpoint Figueiredo. I don't see him finishing Figueiredo. Figueiredo's a tough guy to finish. He's never been finished before. And he's got the power advantage. He just really does. So Joe B's got to be super careful when he's picking his shots. I don't like this for Joe B at all. So from a betting perspective, I like Figueiredo. I also like Figueiredo by the finish as well. You get a little bit better odds with that. So I think this fight does have some finishing potential, which is also why in DFS I really do like Deiveson Figueiredo at 9,000. In that price point, Joe Duffy, Montel Jackson, Grant Dawson, and then Figueiredo. I think Figueiredo's probably, and I don't think Figueiredo's going to need 5 rounds. I think he's going to finish him probably within the first 3 rounds. I think Figueiredo finishes him within the first 3 rounds, but if it goes 5 rounds, you want that. I don't want to say you want that because you want the finish, but if there is no finish, then you're happy that Figueiredo's in a spot where there's 5 rounds because, as I mentioned, he's not the highest output fighter. So when he doesn't finish fighters, like the fight against Formiga, he landed 14 significant strikes. It was so even. It was so little output in that fight. The fact that fight went to decision and he ended up with 7 fantasy points is just ridiculous. When he gets finishes, you're going to see 100, 115 points. He's going to score a lot of points for you. But if it does go to decision, because there's not going to be a ton of output, expect anywhere from that 50, 60 point range, which is kind of a card killer if you're going to pay $9,000 for Figueiredo. For Joe B, he is the fourth cheapest fighter on the card. Joe B's not horrible to have because he is someone that's going to land a ton of significant strikes as long as he doesn't get finished. So if you have a feeling that this fight does go the distance and Figueiredo doesn't finish Joe B, then one, that means Joe B will probably have a chance of winning because of the output that he usually, his performances usually have a ton of output. But two, even if he loses 5 rounds, you're talking potentially, anywhere from 80 to 90 significant strikes if it goes 5 rounds and he doesn't get finished. So even if he loses, he could still put up a 50 spot, which you could do worse when you're paying low 7s for a fighter. So this is a card that I'm not stacking in. I feel like some of these past cards I've said that, you could potentially stack here. This one I'm just not, because I think Figueiredo finishes Joe B. I don't think I'll have any Joe B ownership at all. I'm gonna be avoiding him. All right, so we have gone over all of the fights on this card. And now, if you're still sticking around, this is probably what you're sticking around for. We just killed it last week, or not last week, Wednesday night. Wednesday night cards throwing me off, but this upcoming Saturday night, what is the Manchise doing from a DFS perspective? Well, I'm going to give you my lineup, and it's probably fighters that aren't going to be surprised, that you're not going to be surprised with, because I've already gone over why I like certain fighters. So we'll start with the highest priced fighter and then make our way down. So the highest priced fighter in my optimized lineup would be Grant Dawson at 9,200. Then I would have Davison Figueiredo at 9,000. Roman Dolidze at 8,900. And then Mark Giacchesi at 8,500. Davi Ramos, 7,500. And Joel Alvarez at 6,900, the cheapest fighter on the slate. So again, it's Dawson, Figueiredo, Dolidze, Giacchesi, Ramos, and Alvarez. Let's win some more money this week, man. We're already in the green right now, big time after Wednesday night. Let's keep it rolling. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and stick around next week. Tune in, because I'll be making another video. We're going to keep this hot streak going. Peace.